On a cold January afternoon in 2025, shoppers at a super value supermarket in Hollyhill, on Cork City's north side, were browsing the aisles, selecting groceries, checking their phones, living ordinary lives. Within minutes, that ordinariness would shatter. Masked men burst through the automatic doors wielding baseball bats and wooden pickaxe handles. Two men sprinted toward the back of the store, vaulting over a customer service counter as their pursuers swung metal weapons overhead. Shoppers screamed and scattered. Children clung to their parents. Outside in the car park, a white flatbed pickup truck suddenly roared to life, accelerating directly toward a crowd of people before crashing violently into a parked car, sending it lurching off the ground. By that evening, mobile phone footage of the incident was circulating across Facebook, WhatsApp, and Instagram. It was clear to anyone watching that this was no random act of violence. This was the latest eruption in a long-running feud between two traveller families in Cork, a conflict that had been simmering beneath the surface for years and had now boiled over into terrifying public view. Before we go deeper, subscribe if you love true crime documentaries, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Cork City, Ireland's second-largest urban centre, sits along the River Lee in the country's southwest. It's a place of vibrant culture, historic architecture, and a thriving art scene. But like many cities, Cork has its tensions, its hidden fault lines. Among these are the periodic feuds that erupt within the Irish traveller community, a traditionally nomadic ethnic minority with deep roots in Ireland. Travellers represent roughly 1% of Ireland's population, yet they face disproportionate social marginalisation, discrimination in housing and employment, and significantly lower life expectancy than the settled population. Within this community, disputes between families can escalate rapidly, often fueled by perceived insults, competition over resources, or historical grievances passed down through generations. These feuds are not gang warfare in the conventional sense. They are intensely personal, rooted in honor, reputation, and family loyalty. They can lie dormant for months or years, then flare up with shocking violence. Cork has witnessed several such feuds in recent decades. In 2019, a bitter conflict between the McCarthy and Stokes families grabbed national headlines, culminating in a widely publicized handshake in a graveyard intended to signal peace. But the feud you are about to hear about is different. This is the story of the Fulner and O'Brien families, a conflict that began quietly in the early 2020s and escalated into one of the most violent and public traveller feuds Cork has seen in years. By all accounts, bad blood between the Fulners and the O'Briens had been simmering for some time before it became visible to the outside world. Garda, Ireland's national police force, would later state that the feud had been ongoing for more than 2 years, flaring intermittently as attempts at peace repeatedly broke down. The exact spark that ignited the animosity between these two families remains somewhat murky. Feuds like this rarely have a single, clear origin. They tend to grow out of a complex web of perceived slights, accusations, and retaliations. Perhaps it began with a business dispute, a romantic entanglement, or an insult at a funeral or wedding. In traveller culture, where honor and family reputation are paramount, even a minor slight can become the foundation for years of hostility. What is clear is that by the early 2020s, tensions between the Fulners and the O'Briens were threatening to explode. Both families were well known on Cork's north side, living in areas such as Hollyhill and Knocknaheeny. They were also related through marriage to other traveller groups throughout County Cork and into neighbouring counties like Limerick. This geographic spread would soon make the feud especially difficult to contain. Family members lived not just in Cork City, but in towns and villages scattered across the region. An insult in one place could trigger retaliation in another, drawing in relatives and associates from miles away. Early signs of trouble stayed mostly within the traveller community's own channels. Before the mainstream media took notice, members of both families were posting online taunts and warnings. Social media, particularly Facebook, had become a key battleground for these feuds. Videos and posts served multiple purposes. They allowed feuding parties to threaten and intimidate their rivals publicly, to rally support from their own side, and to claim dominance. For the Garda, these posts provided a troubling glimpse into rising hostilities. By late 2022, Garda intelligence units were aware that tensions were escalating. Officers monitoring social media flagged videos in which masked men brandished weapons and issued direct threats. In one video, a voice warned rivals that they wouldn't be able to eat their Christmas dinner at their own table, that they wouldn't be safe going to the shop or the gym, that violence was coming. These weren't idle threats. They were public declarations of intent, designed to instill fear and to demonstrate that the feud was active and escalating. The Garda faced a challenging dilemma. Traveller feuds are notoriously difficult to police. Victims and witnesses often refuse to cooperate with investigations, fearing reprisals not just against themselves but against their entire families. The code of honor within the community discourages talking to the police, whom many travellers view with deep mistrust, rooted in generations of discrimination and marginalization. Even when Garda have clear evidence, prosecuting feud-related violence can be nearly impossible if no one will testify. Officers knew that the Fulner and O'Brien feud was heating up, but without complainants or witnesses willing to come forward, their hands were often tied. They could increase patrols, monitor social media, and prepare for violence, but stopping it before it happened was another matter entirely. The uneasy peace collapsed in December 2023, not in Cork City itself, but in the market town of Charleville in North Cork. Charleville lies near the border with County Limerick, about 40 kilometres north of Cork City. It's a small town with a population of around 4,000 people, a place where everyone knows everyone, and where sudden violence feels all the more shocking. Charleville was home to branches of one of the feuding families, and it was here that the conflict burst into public view. On Saturday, December 16, 2023, the feud erupted in broad daylight. Rival family members brawled outside the Charleville post office, trading blows in full view of alarmed shoppers and passers-by. Witnesses described seeing men shouting, swinging fists, and chasing each other through the street. The fight spilled over into Holy Cross Cemetery on the edge of town, a solemn place of mourning that was now the scene of chaos. Mourners and visitors at the graveyard looked on in horror as the feuding groups confronted each other among the headstones, shouting insults and threats. The violence continued into the night. Residents of St. Brendan's Drive, a housing estate in Charleville, reported that cars had been smashed and vandalized outside their homes. One family's vehicle had its windows shattered and tires slashed in what was clearly a reprisal for that day's fights. Tensions ran so high that the Garda Armed Support Unit, a specialized tactical team, was deployed to patrol the estate through the night and into the next day to prevent further escalation. For the residents of Charleville, many of whom were not connected to the feud in any way, the experience was terrifying. They found themselves living in a town gripped by violence that felt unpredictable and impossible to escape. Multiple videos surfaced on Facebook that weekend showing groups of men in Charleville wearing balaclavas and wielding weapons. In these clips, the men shouted threats, proclaiming that they would finish off the other side, that the feud would not end until one family was destroyed. The videos were viewed thousands of times, shared across social media platforms, and discussed on local radio shows and in online forums. For the Garda, they provided valuable evidence, but also a troubling indication of how brazen the feuding families had become. These men were not hiding their intentions, they were broadcasting them to the world. By the time New Year's arrived, Charleville residents were exhausted and fearful. Garda investigations into the December incidents were underway, but as of early January 2024, a spokesperson admitted that no arrests had been made. The reasons for this were familiar. Witnesses were reluctant to come forward, evidence was difficult to gather, and the feuding parties were skilled at evading law enforcement. Garda believed that associates of the Cork families from across the county line in Limerick had gotten involved, widening the scope of the conflict. The O'Brien side, in particular, had strong links in County Limerick, and relatives there were being drawn into the fray, bringing with them additional manpower and resources. As investigators pieced together intelligence reports, a troubling pattern emerged. The feud was not confined to fistfights and vandalism. On a Friday night in mid-December, rival cars were seen speeding near Ulla's Cross, a rural area in County Limerick, while occupants traded gunfire. Witnesses reported hearing multiple shots and seeing vehicles racing away at high speed. And the very next day, unknown assailants opened fire on a house in Charleville's Fortlands area and attempted to burn it down by dousing it in fuel. Fortunately, the targeted home was vacant at the time, or the incident could have turned deadly. Windows were blown out by gunshots and scorch marks were left on the walls where the attackers had attempted to set the house alight. For the Garda, this was a terrifying escalation. Firearms and arson represented a significant step up in violence, and the fact that these attacks were happening in quick succession suggested that the feud was spiraling out of control. By the end of 2023, Charleville and its surrounding areas were essentially under siege from this feud. Garda Superintendent Gary McPollin, overseeing the response in North Cork, vowed publicly that the perpetrators would be brought to justice. But as 2024 began, the feud was far from over. In fact, it was about to get significantly worse. After the Charleville clashes, there was a brief lull in open hostilities, a moment of relative quiet that many hoped would last. Garda patrols remained heightened, and community leaders within the traveller community attempted to broker informal truces. But by the summer of 2024, incidents suggested that the feud was heating up once more. In August, an attack occurred that sent shockwaves through the traveller community and beyond. On the night of August 12th, Garda in County Cork responded to reports of a disturbance at a house on the New Line in Charleville. When emergency services arrived at the scene, they found a car that had been considerably damaged outside the house, and the house itself had also been vandalized. Inside, they discovered something far more horrifying. A 12-year-old girl had been seriously injured when an object was thrown through the window of the house. The object struck her in the head, causing severe trauma. Paramedics treated the girl at the scene before rushing her to Cork University Hospital. Given the severity of her injuries, she was then transferred to Children's Health Ireland at Temple Street in Dublin, one of the country's leading paediatric hospitals, where she underwent emergency surgery. Medical staff worked through the night to stabilize her condition. While she survived, the psychological and physical scars of that attack would remain with her for years to come. Superintendent Gary McPollin, leading the investigation, described the attack as a heinous assault on an innocent child. He told reporters that this was a new level of violence, a crossing of a line that even in the brutal world of family feuds should never have been crossed. The fact that a child entirely uninvolved in the feud had been targeted and seriously injured shocked not just the traveller community, but Irish society as a whole. The attack on the child drew widespread condemnation. Local traveller rights organisations issued public statements pleading for an end to the violence. They emphasised that the vast majority of travellers wanted nothing to do with feuding and were sickened by what was happening. Pavee Point, a nationally respected traveller advocacy and mediation organisation based in Dublin, was among those calling for intervention. Traveller community leaders spoke out on local radio, urging the families to put aside their grievances for the sake of their children and the broader community. But the feuding families showed no sign of listening. If anything, they seemed to feed on the attention. Videos continued to surface on Facebook, men posing with weapons, issuing direct threats and taunting the other side. These posts drew outrage from the public and prompted discussions on local radio shows about cracking down on social media misuse. In September 2024, a string of firebombings and shootings terrorized North Cork and Cork City. One night, a petrol bomb was hurled at a house in Knocknaheeny, the Cork City stronghold of the O'Brien family. The homemade explosive device shattered windows and ignited a small fire before being extinguished. Around the same time, over in County Limerick, gunmen sprayed bullets into an empty house in Kilmallock, a property known to be connected to one of the feud factions. Investigators suspected this was a coordinated attack, as each side tried to one-up the other with escalating intimidation tactics. The message was clear: no property was safe, no family member was off-limits. By this point, armed Garda checkpoints had become a fixture in Charleville, and additional detectives were drafted from around the county to help local units. Officers worked long hours, monitoring social media, gathering intelligence and trying to anticipate the next flashpoint. The psychological toll on Garda members was significant. They were dealing with a type of violence that felt almost medieval in its intensity, rooted in notions of honor and revenge that were difficult for outsiders to fully understand. At the same time, they were hamstrung by the lack of cooperation from victims and witnesses. Even when Garda had strong evidence, bringing charges was a challenge. And even when charges were brought, securing convictions was another battle entirely. Ordinary travelers and community leaders in Cork were growing increasingly alarmed and frustrated. Many felt that their entire community was being painted with the same brush because of the actions of a small number of families. Traveller children in schools reported being bullied and taunted because of the feud. Traveller families trying to conduct legitimate business faced increased suspicion and discrimination. The feud was not just destroying the lives of those directly involved, it was having a ripple effect across the entire community, reinforcing negative stereotypes and deepening the social divide between travellers and the settled population. Garda quietly made a few arrests related to the feud's flashpoints, but prosecuting such cases proved difficult. Victims and witnesses often declined to give formal statements, fearing reprisals. In some instances, victims who had been hospitalized with serious injuries refused to identify their attackers, insisting they had tripped or fallen or been in an accident. Garda understood the fear behind these lies, but it made their job nearly impossible. Without testimony, without cooperation, the legal system struggled to function. The feuding families operated in a shadow zone where violence was rampant but accountability was elusive. By late 2024, the Garda were increasingly concerned that the feud would produce a fatality. The weapons being used were becoming more dangerous, the attacks more brazen, and the targets less discriminating. It felt like a matter of time before someone was killed, and when that happened, the cycle of revenge would intensify even further, potentially drawing in more families and spreading the violence across multiple counties. On December 26, 2024, a small incident served as the catalyst for the feud's most violent eruption yet. That afternoon, in a shop in Cork City centre bustling with post-Christmas shoppers, an altercation broke out between members of the rival families. The exact details of what happened remain somewhat unclear, as is often the case in these chaotic encounters. Amid the shouting and scuffling, a pregnant woman understood to be from the Fulner side was allegedly assaulted. The news of this attack on a vulnerable family member spread like wildfire through both camps. In the traveller community, an assault on a pregnant woman is seen as particularly cowardly and dishonourable. For the Fulners, this was an unforgivable insult, a provocation that demanded immediate and overwhelming retaliation. Over the next few days, both sides prepared for confrontation. Social media posts became more frequent and more explicit. Men were seen driving around Cork City in convoys, making their presence known, sending a message that they were ready for war. Garda increased patrols, but they couldn't be everywhere at once. On January 6, 2025, the tension finally exploded in the most public and shocking way yet. That afternoon, at least 15 people became embroiled in running battles inside and around the SuperValu supermarket in Hollyhill. According to Garda evidence, investigators would later piece together a precise sequence of events from CCTV footage. The supermarket, like most modern retail establishments, was equipped with multiple security cameras covering the entrance, the car park, the aisles, and the checkout areas. These cameras captured every moment of the chaos that unfolded. 3 O'Brien men arrived first, pulling into the SuperValu car park in a white Ford Transit flatbed truck at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon. They parked near the entrance and entered the store, apparently intending to shop or perhaps to meet someone. Within minutes, 3 vehicles packed with Fulner family members stormed into the same car park. It is unclear whether the Fulners knew the O'Briens were there or whether this was a chance encounter. What is clear is that the Fulners were ready for violence. Men spilled out of the cars holding weapons. One of them, 18-year-old Charles Fulner, jumped from the front passenger seat of a silver Toyota Avensis, gripping a wooden pickaxe handle in his hands. The pickaxe handle, a common improvised weapon in these feuds, is essentially a heavy wooden club capable of inflicting serious injury or death. Jamie O'Brien, one of the 3 O'Brien men, grabbed a baseball bat from the truck and sprinted away, knowing he was heavily outnumbered. Charlie Fulner chased Jamie around parked cars in the car park, swinging the pickaxe handle at him, while other Fulners engaged the two remaining O'Brien associates outside. Shoppers emerging from the supermarket with their groceries were confronted with a scene of medieval violence, men shouting and chasing each other with weapons, cars revving and screeching. Desperate to escape, Jamie O'Brien ran into the Super Value store. Charlie Fulner and a few others followed right on his heels, pursuing him through the automatic doors and into the aisles. Shoppers screamed and scrambled out of the way. Parents grabbed their children and ran toward the back of the store. Jamie managed to scramble toward the checkout area, vaulting over the counter in an attempt to put a physical barrier between himself and his attackers. At this point, two SuperValue employees, showing remarkable courage, tried to intervene. They shouted at the attackers to leave, to stop, to take their fight outside. In one video clip later shared online, three assailants in dark clothes and face coverings, their features obscured, are seen backing out of the store reluctantly, still brandishing their weapons. The fight spilled back outside into the car park. Another dramatic moment was captured on video by a shocked bystander. As a group of Fulners crowded around the store's entrance, one of the O'Brien men jumped into the cab of the white Ford Transit pickup truck. He revved the engine and suddenly drove at the crowd. Men shouted and scattered as the truck barreled forward, ramming into a parked car with such force that it lifted off the ground on impact. The collision was sickening, the sound of metal crunching and glass shattering echoing across the car park. The pickup's driver then reversed, swerved, and sped off before anyone could grab him, leaving a scene of destruction and chaos in his wake. Charlie Fulner and the rest of his crew piled into a black Volkswagen Passat and other cars and fled at high speed. Garda were called immediately, but by the time officers arrived, the attackers had vanished into the city. Jamie O'Brien survived with only minor injuries, thanks largely to the barrier of the store counter that had shielded him from worse. But the psychological trauma for everyone present, the shoppers, the staff, the children who witnessed it, was profound. This was not violence hidden away in a rural field or a late-night ambush. This was violence in the middle of a busy supermarket on a Monday afternoon, a terrifying demonstration that the feud had reached a point where public safety no longer mattered to the participants. That evening, as Garda were still processing the scene at Hollyhill, drivers in Cork City couldn't believe their eyes. A car drove through the busy Blackpool district with a man hanging out of the passenger window wielding a chainsaw. Astonishingly, he did this while passing directly by the Bridewell Garda station, as if to taunt the authorities, to demonstrate that the feuding families felt untouchable. This stunt was captured on video from within the car and promptly posted to social media. In the footage, the chainsaw-wielding man looks directly into the camera and threatens to cut the limbs off members of the rival family. His voice is calm, almost casual, as if he's discussing the weather rather than issuing threats of mutilation. The video went viral, shared thousands of times within hours, drawing outrage and horror in equal measure. Not to be outdone, the very next day saw retaliation. On January 7, 2025, a group of men launched an attack on a family residence in a suburb south of Cork City. This house had already been targeted before, its windows smashed, its walls scorched by a previous arson attempt. Now the attackers came to finish the job. A gang of men armed with pickaxe handles and baseball bats began systematically destroying the home, smashing every window, battering down doors, and attempting to set the structure on fire. Neighbors called the Garda, but by the time officers arrived, the attackers had fled. Luckily, the building did not catch fire, and nobody inside was physically harmed, though the psychological impact was immense. The family, already traumatized by previous attacks, was now living in a state of constant fear. Within the span of 2 days, the feud had reached a boiling point. Social media teemed with threats from both sides, promising to burn each other's houses down, to target specific individuals by name, to finish what had been started. It felt inevitable that the next encounter could produce a fatality if authorities didn't intervene decisively. The Garda knew they had to act and act fast before someone was killed. On January 10, 2025, Garda launched a major crackdown on the warring families. In the early pre-dawn hours, over 60 officers, including members of the Armed Support Unit and the Regional Support Unit, carried out synchronized raids at multiple locations around Cork City and County. These raids were the result of weeks of intelligence gathering, surveillance, and careful planning. Garda had identified key players from both sides, tracked their movements, and analyzed the social media posts and CCTV footage to build cases against them. Now, it was time to strike. Garda arrested 5 men in these raids, effectively netting ringleaders from both sides. Those detained included Charlie Fulner, the 18-year-old seen wielding a pickaxe handle in SuperValu, as well as 33-year-old Jamie O'Brien, the man he had chased inside the store. Along with them, 2 other Fulner brothers, ages 20 and 26, and another O'Brien relative, aged 24, were taken into custody for questioning. The arrests were carried out with precision. Officers arrived simultaneously at multiple addresses, ensuring that the targets couldn't warn each other or flee. In some locations, officers used battering rams to force entry when doors weren't opened promptly. The raid sent a clear message. The Garda were taking this feud seriously, and those responsible would face the full force of the law. The raids yielded a trove of evidence. Officers seized a large cache of weapons believed to have been used in the feud. Dozens of baseball bats, hooks, pitchforks, and other improvised weapons were found hidden in sheds, garages, and vehicles. Garda also confiscated smartphones and laptops, aiming to trace the social media threats and possibly identify who filmed the various feud videos. Digital forensics teams would spend weeks analyzing these devices, extracting messages, videos, and photos that documented the planning and execution of the attacks. In one location, investigators recovered what appeared to be a grenade pin and fragments, evidence supporting reports that a hand grenade had been thrown at a house shortly before the SuperValu fight. The presence of military-grade explosives represented yet another terrifying escalation, suggesting that the feuding families had access to weapons far beyond what is typically seen in these conflicts. Over the next day, each of the 5 arrested men was formally charged. Charlie Fulner, Michael James Fulner, and Michael Fulner Jr., along with Jamie O'Brien, were all charged with violent disorder for their roles in the SuperValu attack. The charge of violent disorder under Irish law applies when 3 or more people together use or threaten unlawful violence in a manner that would cause a person of reasonable firmness present at the scene to fear for their safety. It carries a maximum sentence of 10 years in prison. Meanwhile, Michael John O'Brien, who had been arrested in possession of charred firelighters and a baseball bat, was charged with criminal damage and arson in relation to the house attack on January 7th. On January 13, 2025, the 5 men appeared in Cork District Court for their initial hearings. The courtroom was packed with family members from both sides, along with journalists and curious members of the public. Security was tight, with Garda stationed throughout the courthouse to prevent any flare-ups. In court, a solicitor for Charlie Fulner made a surprising claim. He told the judge that earlier that same day, at 11 o'clock in the morning, the 2 families had reached a peace agreement to end the feud. This lawyer pointed out that members of both families had posted announcements on Facebook, declaring the feud over and urging no further violence. He argued that his client should be granted bail, as the underlying conflict had been resolved and there was no longer a risk of further incidents. Judge Alison Doran, however, was deeply skeptical. She noted that this supposed peace pact had only come to light after the arrests, and its timing looked suspiciously like a strategic move to influence the court's leniency. Judge Doran had presided over enough feud-related cases to know that promises of peace often evaporated as quickly as they were made. She questioned whether the agreement was genuine or merely a tactical maneuver to secure bail. To ensure any ceasefire was real and lasting, Judge Doran asked whether Pavee Point, a nationally respected traveler advocacy and mediation organization, could be brought in to intervene between the feuding families. It was not common for a judge to suggest outside mediation in the midst of criminal proceedings, but this feud was clearly an extraordinary case. Pavee Point, based in Dublin, had a long history of working with the traveller community. Founded in 1985, it provides advocacy, education and support services to travellers across Ireland. In the past, Pavee Point had helped resolve other traveller feuds through skilled mediation, bringing warring families together to negotiate truces and restore peace. However, in recent years, due to funding cuts and changes in priorities, Pavee Point had scaled back its mediation work. When a defense solicitor contacted Pavee Point on behalf of the court, he learned that they no longer provided direct mediation services. The organization could offer advice and guidance, but it did not have the resources to send mediators to Cork to facilitate a peace process. Despite this setback, the families insisted that they had brokered their own peace deal. Over the next few days, more Facebook posts appeared from both sides, with elders and senior family members stating publicly that the feud was over, that there would be no more violence, and that anyone who broke the peace would be disowned. These posts were viewed cautiously by the Garda and the courts. Words on social media, after all, were easy to produce and cost nothing. The true test would be whether the peace held over time, whether the families could resist the temptation to retaliate, when old grievances resurfaced, and whether younger members of the families who had grown up steeped in the feud's animosity would honor the truce. On Thursday, January 16, 2025, a formal peace meeting was convened at a neutral venue on the north side of Cork City. The location was kept secret to prevent media attention or interference from outsiders. Senior members of the Fulner and O'Brien families sat down face to face, many of them meeting in person for the first time in years. After several hours of tense negotiation, the two feuding families hammered out a peace deal, agreeing to cease all hostilities. They sealed the deal in traditional traveler fashion, with a handshake and a mutual vow that the war was over. Photographs of the handshake were posted to social media, a symbolic gesture intended to signal to both families and the broader traveler community that peace had been achieved. The peace deal brought a desperately needed halt to the violence. In the days and weeks that followed, there were no further attacks, no more social media threats, no convoys of men driving through Cork looking for confrontation. For the residents of Charleville, Hollyhill, Knocknaheeny, and the other areas affected by the feud, life slowly began to return to normal. Parents felt safe taking their children to school. Shoppers returned to the SuperValu in Hollyhill without fear. The Garda cautiously reduced their patrols, though they remained vigilant, knowing that feuds can reignite at any moment. But while the violence had stopped, the court still had to deal with the legal consequences of the feud. Over the course of 2025, the various criminal cases moved slowly through the justice system. The young men arrested, Charlie Fulner, the two other Fulner brothers, Jamie O'Brien and Michael John O'Brien, all eventually appeared for preliminary hearings. They faced serious indictments for armed violent disorder, criminal damage and related offences. Under Irish law, violent disorder cases are typically heard in the Circuit Criminal Court, where sentences can be significantly longer than in the District Court. The evidence against them was substantial. CCTV footage clearly showed their involvement in the attacks. Digital forensics had recovered incriminating messages and videos from their phones. Witnesses, though reluctant, had been identified and in some cases persuaded to provide statements. As of the last reports in late 2025, those legal proceedings were still ongoing. Justice often moves slowly, particularly in complex cases involving multiple defendants and charges. Defense solicitors filed motions, requested disclosure of evidence, and sought delays to prepare their cases. Prosecutors worked methodically to build the strongest possible cases, knowing that any procedural misstep could result in charges being dismissed. The evidence was expected to lead to convictions or guilty pleas in due time, though the specific outcomes remained uncertain. The Fulner-O'Brien feud, while devastating for those directly involved, offers a window into the broader challenges facing Ireland's traveller community and the criminal justice system. Traveller feuds are not a new phenomenon. They have existed for generations, rooted in a culture where family honour, reputation and loyalty are paramount. In a community that has historically been marginalised and excluded from mainstream Irish society, these internal disputes can feel like the only form of justice available. When someone feels wronged, they may not trust the Garda or the courts to deliver justice. Instead, they turn to their family for protection and retribution. This creates a cycle of violence that is extraordinarily difficult to break. For the Garda, policing traveller feuds presents unique challenges. The code of silence within the community makes gathering evidence and securing testimony nearly impossible. Even when officers have clear video evidence of a crime, without witnesses willing to testify, prosecutions often fail. At the same time, heavy-handed policing can reinforce the community's mistrust of law enforcement, making cooperation even less likely. Garda must walk a delicate line, enforcing the law while also building relationships with community leaders who can help mediate disputes before they escalate to violence. The use of social media in this feud also highlights a modern dimension to these ancient conflicts. 20 years ago, feud-related threats and taunts would have been communicated through word of mouth or in face-to-face encounters. Now they are broadcast to thousands of people via Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp. This serves to escalate tensions, as insults and threats are seen by entire communities and demand a response. It also provides law enforcement with a wealth of evidence, as participants often incriminate themselves by posting videos and messages documenting their involvement in violence. Yet prosecuting social media-based threats is complex. Proving who posted a video, who held the camera, and whether a threat was genuine or performative requires sophisticated digital forensics and careful legal arguments. The attack on the 12-year-old girl in August 2024 represented a particularly dark moment in the feud. Historically, even in the most bitter traveller feuds, there has been an unwritten rule that children are off limits. The fact that a child was seriously injured, whether intentionally or accidentally, shocked the traveller community and the wider public. It prompted calls for stronger intervention, not just from the Garda but from community leaders, social workers and mediators. Yet the challenge remains. How do you intervene in a conflict where the participants do not trust outside authorities and where the community's internal mechanisms for conflict resolution have broken down? Pavee Point and other traveller advocacy organisations have long argued that addressing feuds requires more than policing. It requires investment in education, employment, and social inclusion for the traveller community. When travellers have access to opportunities, when their children can go to school without facing discrimination, when families can find stable housing and employment, the conditions that fuel feuds begin to diminish. But these are long-term solutions, and they require political will and sustained funding, both of which have been in short supply. The peace deal brokered between the Fulners and O'Briens in January 2025 was a positive development, but it is not a permanent solution. Feuds can lie dormant for years before reigniting over a new perceived slight. The younger generation in particular poses a challenge. Many of the young men involved in this feud have grown up knowing nothing but animosity toward the other family. They have been socialized into a culture of vendetta, where backing down is seen as weakness and where family loyalty demands participation in violence. Changing that mindset requires not just a handshake and a Facebook post, but a deep cultural shift, supported by education, mentorship, and alternative pathways to earning respect and status within the community. The legal proceedings against the 5 men arrested in January 2025 will eventually conclude. Some may receive significant prison sentences, others may receive suspended sentences or be released on time served, depending on their prior records and the strength of the evidence. But regardless of the outcomes, the underlying issues that fueled the feud remain. Until those issues are addressed, until the traveller community has genuine access to justice, opportunity and inclusion, feuds like this will continue to erupt, tearing families apart and terrorizing communities. The Fulner-O'Brien feud is a story of honour and revenge, of violence and resilience, of a community struggling to navigate its place in modern Ireland. It is a story that challenges us to think beyond simple narratives of crime and punishment, to consider the historical and social forces that shape behaviour, and to ask what kind of society we want to build. For the families involved, the scars of this feud, both physical and psychological, will last a lifetime. For the residents of Cork, it serves as a reminder that violence, once unleashed, is difficult to contain. And for Ireland as a whole, it is a call to action, a demand that we confront the marginalisation and exclusion that continue to plague the traveller community, and that we work together to build a more just and inclusive society for all.